It was 7 a.m. at the busy street of Ladipo, and countless of customers had gathered at Madam Nkechi's restaurant. Countless of lines had been formed, and the waitresses were very busy. At Madam Nkechi's restaurant, there are three chambers: the tent where customers are served, the storerooms where the raw foods are kept, and the inner room, the large kitchen where Madam Nkechi cooked. Most mornings, the busy street of Ladipo was abuzz with noises from cars, motorcycles, and passers-by. But the noises has no effect compared with what made Ladipo what it is: the sweet aroma of Madam Nkechi's kitchen. All the meals at Madam Nkechi's restaurant were unique and mouth-watering. The white soup, the egusi, the jollof rice and stew, salad with assorted meats, grills, and so much more. Madam Nkechi's day at the kitchen usually begins by 2 a.m. in the morning. After she was done with cooking, Mrs. Ogugwa and Mrs. Kate were the only two waitresses who were allowed to come over to the kitchen to pack whatever she had cooked. They will come over to the kitchen with a very shiny clean pot. They will transfer the already cooked food inside and put it on the counter. From the counter, they can now dish the foods and serve the waiting customers. This prevents the customers from knowing what is going on at the kitchen. At Madam Nkechi's kitchen, a lot has been going on, all of which is a well-kept secret between Madam Nkechi and the two most senior waitresses, Mrs. Ogugwa and Mrs. Kate. They alone were the only waitresses allowed to visit the kitchen. Right at the corner of the kitchen is a big dustbin dump with smell oozing out from the decomposing rats that were long dead. Maggots flowed from the body of the rats just like water would flow down a stream. Flies buzzed up and around the kitchen area. The decomposing vegetables and odors from the decomposing fish left the whole kitchen area in a very offensive odor that was almost indescribable. To make sure that no passers-by get a hint of what was happening, the kitchen area was securely locked, making the place as hot as oven. The chimney alone was the only outlet through which air passes out from the kitchen. As Madam Ogugwa and Madam Kate comes in to carry the food, they masked their noses with nose masks as they hurriedly transferred the food and hurried away to the inside of the restaurant where they serve people. Once in a while, a customer would see one or two flies in their food, but they will still maintain their cool. After all, inside the restaurant is quite neat and the food is so mouth-watering and affordable. And in case you don't want to eat, there are hundreds of people who will be willing to take over your plate and get themselves served at the counter. One day, as Madam Kate stood at the entrance of the kitchen, watching Madam Nkechi stir her large pot of soup, with the dirty sweat on her face dripping into the pot of soup, and large swarm of flies hovering around, her stomach suddenly began to churn. She tried to control her urge to go outside to throw up, but it was simply uncontrollable. She rushed outside, and soon she was close to a bush and she began to throw up. But how does this woman manage to stay for hours in this kitchen while cooking? She wondered to herself after throwing up. That was when she summoned the courage to confront Madam Nkechi. At the end of the day's work, Mrs. Kate summoned Madam Nkechi by the side. I know it's not easy waking up by 2 a.m. to cook for the whole of Ladipo, but the cleanliness of the kitchen is at the soul of this business. Madam, please contract out the cleaning of this kitchen to a cleaning company. Let them come at night, at the close of the day's work, and clean out every dirt and throw the dustbin as well. It might cost you some money, but it will save us a fortune. Which fortune will it save you, huh? Asked Madam Nkechi, her face red with anger. It will save the longevity of this restaurant if we secure the health of our customers by ensuring proper hygiene. Then our restaurant will last long, answered Mrs. Kate. It was at this point that Madam Nkechi, who had been busy stirring her large pot of soup, raised up her dirty, sweaty face. She eyed Madam Kate. Hey, Madam Advisor, what do you know about restaurant business and how many restaurants have you managed? It's better you mind your business if you still want to continue to work in this restaurant. If not, see the door. Go and try your own restaurant business. Let's see how neat you can be. Mrs. Kate was speechless. She meant no harm. She only wanted her madam to clean out the kitchen so that their restaurant will not be at the risk of being closed down. As Madam Kate works in Madam Nkechi's restaurant every day, she's always filled with fear and guilt. She always feels that she is poisoning people and putting them at health risk as she served them. On getting home that night, Mrs. Kate had a long and hard thought about what had been going on in her workplace. She could no longer live her life in fear and guilt because she's trying to earn a living. She therefore decided to resign. Armed with courage, Mrs. Kate dropped her resignation letter with Madam Nkechi's restaurant the very next day. She began looking for other jobs, but unfortunately, she could not lay her hands on anything. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months, and then one day, Mr. Okon, the owner of Okon's restaurant, a very small restaurant down the street of Ladipo, called Mrs. Kate for an interview. According to your CV, you used to work at Madam Nkechi's restaurant, Mr. Okon asked. Why will you resign from such a big restaurant and come to apply in this my little restaurant? Mr. Okon continued. It's because their work ethics does not match out with my belief system, replied Mrs. Kate. How do you mean? Such a big restaurant. They must have been paying you a large sum, aren't they? Mr. Okon pressed. Their pay is not the issue, said Mrs. Kate. They do not consider hygiene as part of their work ethics. I feel guilty each time I serve my customers meals from that restaurant. I've talked to the owner to employ more hands who can tidy up the kitchen, and she was adamant on changing. There is nothing else I can do than to resign, said Mrs. Kate. Mr. Okon was impressed with Mrs. Kate. That is exactly the kind of employee he needs. Now he wants to retire and needs new hands in his management team. He therefore quickly hired her, and Mrs. Kate, now a part of Mr. Okon's team, worked very hard at maintaining a good hygiene and serving their customers better. Meanwhile, the reports of the number of Madam Nkechi's customers who visited the hospital was on the increase. At the General Hospital Ladipo, the doctors admitted many people on one particular weekend on cases related to food poisoning. Their cases were always associated with bloody diarrhea, vomiting, and fever. At one of the male wards that particular weekend, 6 different patients were admitted. They were vomiting, they had bloody diarrhea, and also had fever. The doctors examined them. The chief doctor, Dr. Abioye, examined their report one by one. "What did you eat since the last 48 hours?" Dr. Abioye asked. That is when he found out that the six of them had eaten from the same restaurant within the past 48 hours. "Which restaurant is that?" Dr. Abioye further asked. "It's Madame Nkechi's restaurant, that one down the street." The doctor cleared his throat and said, "There is a severe outbreak of salmonellosis in that restaurant." He then reported to the chief medical director, who called at the Office of the Environmental Health Hazard Management. The next day, the Office of the Environmental Health stormed Madame Nkechi's restaurant. What they saw was simply unbelievable. The Lagos Television Authority was also there to cover the inspection of Madam Nkechi's restaurant. That Sunday, many Lagosians watched as many more drama unfolds at Madam Nkechi's restaurant. Even the patients who were lying down at their hospital beds watched in horror as the root cause of their recurrent infection was discovered. Madam Nkechi was arrested and was taken to the court. Within the week, an angry mob gathered at Madam Nkechi's restaurant. They demonstrated their anger as many more television houses and radio stations were there to cover their demonstrations. Madam Nkechi was sued to the court by the Office of the Environmental Health. She kept lamenting and alleging that an enemy had done this to her. "I know who exactly is behind this, and I promise the person that she will never go scot-free." Ever before the health officers arrested Madam Nkechi, Mr. Okon had traveled to the United States of America, handing over the management of his restaurant to Mrs. Kate, his most trusted employee. With the turn of events, the health officers also went about inspecting all the restaurants all over Ladipo and beyond. Mr. Okon's restaurant, under the management of Mrs. Kate, was also displayed on the Lagos State Television Authority as the health workers inspected it. That was when people saw that it was the neatest restaurant around. The news spread like wildfire, and with Madam Nkechi's restaurant having been shut down, the busy street of Ladipo turned to Mr. Okon's restaurant after discovering that it was the neatest restaurant around. Mr. Okon's restaurant, with its newfound reputation as the neatest restaurant, began to soar. Its customers doubled, even quadrupled. Many people began to recommend the restaurant. They are not only the neatest around, but they also cook the best meals. Mr. Okon was happy with the new turn of events. He decided to promote Mrs. Kate from being his manager in the restaurant to making her a shareholder in his business. Madam Nkechi was in court for many days, after which the court granted her bail. But she could no longer manage a restaurant until she had undergone a year training at the Environmental Health Institute. The whole crowd who used to gather at Madam Nkechi's restaurant, trooping in and out to eat their breakfast, lunch, and dinner, have now diverted to Mr. Okon's restaurant. Madam Nkechi was very furious when she came back from the court and discovered that Mr. Okon's restaurant, under the management of Mrs. Kate, had taken over all her customers at the street of Ladipo. Madam Nkechi was so furious at Mrs. Kate. One evening, she was at Mrs. Kate's house. You, this evil woman, you have decided to bite the finger that fed you. You did not leave me in peace, but you went ahead to report me to the environmental health officers. Look at how I have been embarrassed all over Lagos State and all over the country as well. The next day, Madam Nkechi was at Baba Asese shrine. There is a woman who have touched me at the wrong place. She has closed down my booming restaurant business I want my own pound of flesh. I want you to strike her with stroke. Let her whole body and her hands become paralyzed. Let's now see with which hands she will use and cook in her new restaurant." Baba Asisi nodded understandably. "Chai, young woman, I understand how you feel. That paralysis, is exactly what fits her. Let's now see the hand with which she will cook." Baba Asisi cleared his throat. "Young woman, that request of yours will cost you only but 100,000. Though Madam Nkechi was broke, her account balance was 105,000 naira. But Madam Nkechi was more than willing to part with 100,000 naira just to get back at Mrs. Kate. Having spent a lot to bail herself, Madam Nkechi was broke, but she doesn't mind. In 24 hours, you will receive the news about Mrs. Kate's paralysis. After 24 hours, however, Madam Nkechi began to feel heaviness all over her body. By the time it was evening, Madam Nkechi could not lift her hands up. Her mouth was bending at one side. "Take me to Baba Asisi's shrine," Madam Nkechi managed to tell her children. Her children quickly carried her to Baba Asisi's shrine. Baba Asisi was very surprised. "Chai, this is a case of backfired charm," Baba Asisi said. "To remove the effect of the charm, you have to bring another 200,000 naira only so that I can reverse it. What you sent to Mrs. Kate went back to you, the sender. That is why I need double of the money you used in sending the paralysis to reverse it back," explained Baba Asisi. But Madam Nkechi remained paralyzed for many years because she could not raise the 200,000 naira. Meanwhile, Mrs. Kate continued to wax stronger in her business. She had so many customers and in turn employed many more people. She increased her shares at Mr. Okon's restaurant. Mr. Okon in turn was happy to have an effective manager of his restaurant he had founded while he enjoyed his retirement in the United States. As Okon's restaurants grew, Mrs. Kate expanded her workforce, making sure that her employees got some percentage of the profit they made from their expansion. Her workforce grew stronger and more reliable with a commitment to serve people better. At the end of that fiscal year, Mrs. Kate expanded so much that she bought over Madam Nkechi's place, reconstructing it into a mega restaurant that expanded their services beyond Ladipo. They had many online dispatch riders and were able to expand their scope of service beyond the traditional restaurant services. Hey friends, the lesson of this story is to let business owners know that the growth of their business depends on their ability to serve people with utmost sincerity and love. Your team are part of your helpers towards achieving this goal. Their sincere opinion must be valued and their input appreciated. If Madam Nkechi had listened to Mrs. Kate, her restaurant would have expanded and she wouldn't at any point face the embarrassment she faced. Please share your thoughts on the comment section below and kindly subscribe as we load you with lots of interesting and educative tales at African Tales by Oma. Bye for now.